The weight of my father's funeral ring felt heavier than it should as I stood in the grand foyer of our family mansion, watching the last of the mourners trickle out. Their whispered condolences barely registered. I had heard them all before, empty words wrapped in politeness. At 28, I never imagined standing here, alone, parentless, and uncertain of what came next. The chandeliers overhead cast long, golden shadows across the marble floors. The house felt cavernous now, colder, as if my father's absence had drained the warmth from its walls. His booming laugh, the sound of his presence, was gone. Darlings, these events are always so exhausting, aren't they? Lexi's voice, smooth and saccharine, sliced through my grief like a knife dipped in honey. My stepmother stood near the staircase, her black silk dress perfectly fitted, not a single strand of her sleek hair out of place. Despite a long day of mourning, she looked untouched, as if grief had merely brushed past her instead of sinking into her bones like it had mine. "You should freshen up, dear. Your mascara is smudging," she added, her lips curving into something between a smile and a smirk. I didn't answer. I just turned away. Let her play her part, the grieving widow with her carefully placed tears and dramatic sighs. I knew better. Lexi's heels clicked against the marble as she stepped closer, her diamond rings catching the light. "We need to discuss estate matters tomorrow. Some financial things require immediate attention." The way she said it, so smooth, so rehearsed, sent a flicker of unease through me. Before I could respond, a familiar presence appeared at my side. "Miss Cynthia." I turned to find Mauricio, our butler of 20 years, standing there, his face as unreadable as ever. He had been a fixture in this house longer than Lexi had, a quiet force in the background of my childhood. "I need a word with you. In private," he said. Lexi's grip on my shoulder tightened briefly before she let go. "Of course," she murmured, eyes sharp despite her practiced warmth. "I'll be in the study if anyone needs me." She disappeared down the hall, her presence lingering even after she was gone. Mauricio led me to the kitchen, where the scent of fading flowers and spilled champagne lingered. Away from prying eyes, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Your father asked me to give you this. After the funeral." The paper was slightly yellowed, as if time had been waiting for me to open it. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "My dear Cynthia, if you are reading this, I failed to tell you the truth in person, and for that, I am sorry." My breath caught. I gripped the paper tighter. "The mansion, our home, it belongs to you. It always has." I stared at the words, the ink smudged slightly, as if my father's hands had hesitated when writing them. "Lexi doesn't know. The will reading tomorrow will reveal everything. But I needed you to know first." A sharp exhale left me as I reached the last line. "Be careful, sweetheart. Watch the shadows." My hands shook as I lowered the letter. "Mauricio, did you know about this?" His gaze was steady. "I know many things, Miss Cynthia, including the fact that Mrs. Bryant has been making calls to real estate agents this past week." A bitter laugh escaped me. "She's trying to sell my house. Your stepmother has always been ambitious." His voice lowered. "But there's more you should know." A creak in the hallway made me stiffen. "Cynthia?" Francesca's voice rang out from the foyer. Mauricio stepped back smoothly, his expression unreadable once again. "We'll talk later." My best friend burst into the room, dark curls wild, eyes filled with concern. "Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." I folded the letter quickly, tucking it into my pocket. "I'm fine," I said. Then I met her gaze. Actually, no. I wasn't fine at all. The mansion felt different at night. The high ceilings and grand chandeliers that once radiated warmth now loomed with an eerie stillness. Shadows stretched long across the Persian rugs, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt impossibly loud. Francesca and I crept into my father's study, our footsteps silent against the wooden floor. The heavy mahogany desk sat untouched, his chair still slightly pulled out, as if he'd just stepped away. "You sure about this?" Francesca whispered, her breath barely audible. I nodded. If my dad left me that letter, he left more. And I need to know what it is before Lexi tries to bury it. We moved quickly. I ran my fingers along the shelves, the desk drawers, feeling for anything out of place. Francesca checked the cabinets, flipping through files and ledgers. Then I saw it. The massive landscape painting behind my father's desk, the one he had never let anyone move. "Help me," I said, stepping onto the chair to reach the frame. Together, we lifted the heavy painting off the wall, struggling to keep our grip. As soon as it came free, my stomach clenched. There it was, a safe. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my ears. I had only seen this safe a handful of times, when I was little, when Dad would lock away things he never spoke about. "Do you know the combination?" Francesca asked. I exhaled slowly, remembering something my father had told me years ago. "Your mother's birthday, our anniversary, and yours. Some dates are too important to forget." I reached out with shaking fingers and turned the dial. One number, then the second, then the third. Click. The safe door swung open. Francesca and I exchanged a look before turning our attention inside. Stacks of folders and legal documents lined the shelves, but my eyes landed on two things immediately: a thick manila envelope with my name written across it, and a USB drive labeled insurance. I grabbed them both. Francesca reached for one of the folders, flipping it open. "Cynthia?" Her voice trailed off, and when I looked over, my blood ran cold. Photographs. Dozens of them. Lexi sitting in cafes and restaurants, always with different men. And I recognized some of them. Dan Parker, our family lawyer. James Monroe, my father's investment advisor. Lexi had been meeting with them for years. I clenched my jaw, flipping through the photos. The timestamps on the back dated back over 5 years, while my father was still alive. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew she was playing him." A sudden creak from the hallway made us both freeze. Francesca's eyes went wide. "Someone's out there." I shoved the USB and the envelope into my pocket. "Quick, the safe," she hissed. We scrambled, replacing the documents and slamming the safe shut. I grabbed the painting, barely managing to lift it back onto the wall just as the door swung open. I nearly screamed. Mauricio stood in the doorway, his face unreadable as always. "Miss Cynthia," he said in a low voice. "Mrs. Bryant is awake. She's asking for you." Francesca and I exchanged glances. "At this hour?" Francesca frowned. Mauricio's eyes flicked to the painting and back to me. "She couldn't sleep. She's in the kitchen." I exhaled sharply, smoothing my dress. "All right. I'll handle it." Francesca grabbed my arm before I could leave. "Are you sure?" I nodded, gripping the letter in my pocket. "She's the one who should be worried, not me." As I stepped out of the study, my father's last words echoed in my mind. "Watch the shadows." The kitchen lights were harsh against my tired eyes as I stepped inside. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the sharp sting of whiskey. Lexi sat at the marble island, her silk robe draped loosely over her shoulders, a glass of amber liquid swirling in her manicured hand. She didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, she looked expectant. "Couldn't sleep either, darling?" she asked, her voice smooth, dripping with false warmth. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and let the water run. My mind was racing, my fingers tightening around the cool metal of the counter. I could feel the weight of my father's letter in my pocket, the proof tucked away where she couldn't reach it. Lexi took another sip, watching me carefully. "We need to talk about tomorrow. The estate, the debts, the responsibilities that come with all of this." She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, as if the mansion itself was a burden she carried. "Your father left some complicated financial matters behind. Ones you may not fully understand." I turned, finally facing her. "Is that so?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Cynthia, I know you think you're ready to take this on, but managing an estate like this? It's not as easy as it seems. The taxes alone are overwhelming, and the upkeep, well, let's just say it requires more experience than you have." She tilted her head, her expression shifting into something almost motherly. That's why I wanted to talk before the will reading. There are ways we can handle this together. I can guide you through it, help you make the right choices. I let her speak. Let her weave her web. Then I pulled out my phone and scrolled the photos. The ones from the safe. The ones showing her cozy meetings with Dan Parker, my father's lawyer. The ones with James Monroe, my father's financial advisor. The timestamps. The dates. I turned the screen toward her. Care to explain these? For the first time, her glass paused halfway to her lips. The color drained just slightly from her face, but to her credit, she recovered quickly. She reached for the phone, but I pulled it back. Where did you get those? Her voice was steady, but I could hear the edge creeping in. That doesn't matter, I said, taking a step closer. What matters is that Dad wasn't as oblivious as you thought. He knew about your meetings. He knew what you were planning. And now so do I. Her fingers tightened around the glass, her jaw clenched. But still, she forced a laugh. Cynthia, darling, you have no idea what you're talking about, she said, shaking her head. I met with them to protect this estate. Your father, he was making terrible decisions toward the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. Someone had to step in before he ruined everything. I let out a breathy laugh, one filled with disbelief. You mean before he could stop you from trying to steal everything out from under me? Her expression hardened. You're just a child playing dress-up in a world you don't understand. And yet, I said, stepping closer, this child is the rightful owner of this house. The will reading tomorrow will prove it. Every deed, every document, every account, Dad made sure of that. Not you. For the first time since I had known her, Lexi's confident facade cracked. Just for a second. Just enough for me to see the fear creeping into her eyes. I leaned in. So maybe you should start packing? I turned, walking toward the hallway. Cynthia, she called after me, her voice sharp, desperate. We can work something out. We're family after all. I stopped at the doorway, glancing back at her. Family doesn't try to sell each other's homes behind their backs. Then I walked away, leaving her alone with nothing but her empty glass and the truth she could no longer escape. The morning sun poured through the mansion's towering windows, casting golden light across the antique furniture. But despite the warmth outside, the air inside was tense, humming with anticipation. I stood in the dining room, spreading out the evidence across the long mahogany table, bank statements, legal documents, surveillance photos, and the USB drive that held even more damning proof. The weight of it all settled in my chest. Jesus, Cynthia, Raphael muttered, running a hand through his dark hair as he examined the papers. You really found all of this in Dad's study? I nodded. Dad wasn't blind, Raph. He knew what Lexi was doing. He just didn't get the chance to stop her himself. Raphael, my cousin, had always been the calm, level-headed one in the family. While others lost themselves in power plays and family politics, he had stayed neutral. Until now. He exhaled, shaking his head. She's been planning this for years. Selling the mansion, forging signatures, moving money into offshore accounts. He lifted one of the photos, Lexi sitting across from Dan Parker, our family's lawyer, in a dimly lit restaurant. And Dan Parker is knee-deep in it too. I swallowed hard. Yeah. And they have no idea that we know? Raphael looked at me, his expression shifting from disbelief to determination. All right. We play this smart. We don't confront her directly until the will reading. If we show our hand too soon, she'll try to twist the narrative. I met his gaze. You think she'll fight it? He let out a humorless laugh. Oh, she's not the type to go down quietly. A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Francesca poked her head inside, eyes flicking between the documents and our faces. Just a heads up, Lexi and Dan are in the study. And they're scheming. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. Of course they are. Raphael smirked. Let's take a walk. We moved quietly through the halls of the mansion, careful not to draw attention. As we neared the study, we slowed our pace. The door was cracked open just enough for us to hear them. We need to control the narrative, Lexi was saying, her voice sharp. Cynthia is young, inexperienced. We push the idea that she's not capable of managing an estate like this. Dan's voice followed, low and tense. And if the will confirms, she owns everything? A pause. Then Lexi exhaled, irritated. Then we contest it. We argue Edward was mentally incompetent when he made those decisions. I'll find a doctor to back it up if I have to. I clench my fists. Raphael placed a firm hand on my shoulder, shaking his head. Not yet. Dan sighed. Look, Lexi, we need to be careful. If Cynthia has anything on us. She doesn't, Lexi cut him off. She's been mourning. She hasn't had time to dig into anything. And by the time she does, I'll have already moved forward with the sale. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Raphael leaned in, whispering in my ear, let them keep believing that. I nodded. Just then, Mauricio appeared at the end of the hall, his presence always unnervingly silent. He inclined his head slightly. The will reading is about to begin. Raphael smirked. Well, this should be fun. I turned away from the study, my grip tightening on the evidence in my pocket. Let them plot. They were about to find out exactly how much power I held. The grand parlor was silent, the tension thick as the family gathered for the reading of my father's will. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, now held nothing but sharp gazes and unsaid words. I sat beside Raphael and Francesca, my hands folded in my lap, keeping my expression neutral. Across from us, Lexi perched gracefully on the love seat, dressed in an elegant black dress, playing the role of the grieving widow to perfection. Beside her sat Dan Parker, his usual smug confidence in place. But there was something in his eyes, something uneasy. The lawyer, an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Before we begin, I must inform you that Edward Bryant made an unusual request regarding this reading. Lexi's painted smile flickered. Unusual how? The lawyer nodded to his assistant, who walked to the far end of the room and set up a laptop and projector. The moment the screen flickered to life, my heart clenched. My father's face appeared. Not the weakened man I had last seen in his hospital bed, but strong, healthy 6 months ago. Gasps rippled through the room. If you're watching this, my father's voice filled the space, steady and clear, then I am no longer here. And if I know my wife, she is sitting in this very room, expecting to take control of everything I built. Lexi stiffened, her grip tightening on the arms of her chair. But you won't, my father continued, because you never had control to begin with. The color drained from Lexi's face. I knew, Lexi. I knew about the secret meetings, the offshore accounts, the loans you took out in my name while I was sick. You thought I was too blind to see it, but I did. And I made sure Cynthia would, too. A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Dan Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This is absurd. The man was sick when this was recorded. The video continued, cutting him off. I wasn't delusional. I wasn't confused. I was preparing. The screen changed, showing images, surveillance photos of Lexi with Dan Parker, with James Monroe, with a handful of other men. Screenshots of bank transfers. Copies of legal documents with forged signatures. My father's voice darkened. Every shady deal. Every betrayal. Every lie. It's all documented. And as of this morning, it's in the hands of my lawyers and the FBI. Lexi's composure finally cracked. No, this isn't real. He wouldn't. Check your accounts, Lexi. My father's recorded voice challenged. They've already been frozen. Lexi shot to her feet, eyes blazing. You little... Sit down, Raphael said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. She turned on him, wild and desperate. You're going to let this child steal everything from me? I stood, finally speaking. You stole from him. You forged documents, you lied. You tried to sell a house that was never yours. I gestured to the lawyer. And now we're going to prove it. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, flipping open the official documents. Per Mr. Bryant's final wishes, the estate, including this mansion, all properties and financial assets, legally belong to Cynthia Bryant. This was protected under a trust established by her mother and reaffirmed by Mr. Bryant in his final months. Lexi shook her head, her hands trembling. No, no, I was his wife. He wouldn't do this to me. My father's voice answered her from the screen. You are never more than a well-dressed thief, Lexi. And now it's time you face the consequences. Dan Parker stood suddenly. This is highly irregular. We have grounds to contest. You have nothing. I cut in. And if you push this any further, I'll make sure the Bar Association hears exactly how you helped Lexi commit fraud. Dan paled. He was calculating his next move, but he knew. It was over. Lexi turned to him, desperate. Dan, do something. Dan took a step back. I think I've done enough. Lexi's eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for someone, anyone, to help her. But there was no one left. The FBI agents entered quietly through the double doors, their badges flashing. Mrs. Bryant? She turned, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with panicked fury. You're under investigation for financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Lexi let out a laugh, sharp and bitter, her last act of defiance. You think this is over? She turned to me, her face twisted with rage. You don't know how to run this estate, Cynthia. You'll fail. You'll lose everything, just like your mother would have. I took a slow step toward her, looking her straight in the eye. You underestimated my mother. My voice was steady, unwavering. Just like you underestimated me. The agent placed a hand on her arm. Mrs. Bryant, let's go. Lexi's mask shattered as they led her away. I watched her go, feeling nothing but relief. As the doors closed behind her, Raphael let out a breath.
Well, that was satisfying.
Francesca nudged me, smiling. How does it feel to take back what's yours? I looked around the grand room, the same one where my father had once stood, where my mother had built our family's legacy. It feels like justice. 3 days after the will reading, I should have felt relieved. Lexi was gone, the mansion was mine, and the truth was finally out. But I knew better than to believe she would accept defeat so easily. Mauricio found me in the study, his usual stoic expression giving away a rare flicker of concern. Miss Cynthia, he said, holding out a small envelope. This was delivered by courier. I hesitated before taking it, already knowing what it was. Inside was a formal legal notice. Lexi had filed an emergency injunction, attempting to contest the will. Attached was a letter from her new lawyers, ones who weren't just aggressive, but dangerous. They're claiming Dad was mentally incompetent when he changed his will, I muttered, scanning the papers. And that I manipulated him into cutting her out. Raphael snatched the letter from my hands, reading over my shoulder. She's grasping at straws. Maybe, Francesca said, pacing near the bookshelves. But she has money, connections, and no morals. That makes her dangerous. A sharp knock at the study door interrupted us. Mauricio opened it, revealing someone I hadn't seen in years. Melina, my half-sister. She stepped inside, her presence like a storm rolling through the room. Her sharp cheekbones and designer clothes made her look like Lexi, but her eyes, Dad's eyes, held something different. Well, she said, tossing her purse onto the desk. Looks like I got here, just in time. I folded my arms.
What do you want, Melina?
She smirked, leaning against the desk.
Relax.
I didn't come to fight. I came to help, Raphael scoffed. Since when do you help anyone but yourself? Melina ignored him, pulling a USB drive from her pocket. Because, little sister, I know exactly what Lexi is about to try. And I have proof to shut her down for good. I exchanged a glance with Raphael before stepping forward. What kind of proof? She tossed the USB onto the desk. Everything. The other men. The other families. Lexi's been pulling this con for years. Dad wasn't her first target. He was just her biggest. She married 2 wealthy men before him, bled them dry, and then disappeared before she could face consequences. And she almost did it again. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Melina's smirk faded. Because I was angry. Because I hated Dad for choosing her over my mother. And because for a long time I let Lexi control me, too. But watching her destroy this family made me realize I was on the wrong side. I studied her, searching for any sign of deception. But there was none. Raphael picked up the USB, flipping it in his hand. If this is real, it could bury her. It's real, Melina said. It has bank records, signed affidavits from her previous husbands, and even surveillance footage of her bribing officials to cover her tracks. She met my eyes. You want to take her down? This is how we do it. Francesca grabbed a laptop and plugged in the USB. Files filled the screen. Documents, photos, audio recordings. It was overwhelming. I clenched my fists. This is more than just a family dispute now. She's not just a gold digger, she's a criminal. Raphael nodded. We take this to court. And this time, we make sure she never gets back up. Melina smirked. That's the spirit. I exhaled, feeling the weight of it all settle in. Lexi had played her last card. And now it was time for us to end the game. The courtroom was packed. Tension crackled in the air, thick with whispered speculation and shifting glances. At the front of the room, Lexi sat beside her new, high-powered attorneys, looking as pristine as ever in a navy blue suit, her expression a careful mask of concern. But I saw the truth in her eyes. Beneath the polished veneer, she was rattled. I took my seat beside my legal team, with Raphael and Francesca behind me. Melina sat farther back, watching with arms crossed, waiting for the moment Lexi would fall. The judge, an older man named Judge Harrison, adjusted his glasses. We are here today to address the emergency injunction filed by Mrs. Alexis Bryant, contesting the last will and testament of the late Edward Bryant. Mrs. Bryant, your counsel may proceed. Lexi's lead attorney stood, a well-groomed man with a sharp jawline and even sharper words. Your Honor, my client was married to Edward Bryant for over a decade. During his final months, he exhibited erratic behavior and poor judgment. We believe the changes made to his will were coerced by Miss Cynthia Bryant, who sought to exclude my client from what is rightfully hers. I scoffed under my breath. Rightfully hers? My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Carter, rose with a calm, practiced ease. Your Honor, the claim that Edward Bryant was mentally incompetent is false. In fact, we have medical records and testimony from his doctors stating he was of sound mind when he finalized his estate plans. She handed a file to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Evelyn continued, additionally, we have substantial evidence that Mrs. Bryant was involved in financial fraud, forging Mr. Bryant's signature on bank documents and secretly transferring assets to offshore accounts. Lexi's smile barely faltered, but I saw her fingers tighten around the table's edge. Judge Harrison frowned. Do you have proof of these allegations? Raphael leaned in and whispered, Showtime. Evelyn nodded. We do, Your Honor. If it pleases the court, we'd like to present a series of documents, bank statements, and audio recordings proving Mrs. Bryant's involvement in fraudulent activity. The courtroom's projector flickered to life, displaying the first slide, scanned copies of forged financial documents, the ink barely distinguishable from my father's real signature. Then came the screenshots of Lexi's meetings with Dan Parker, our former family lawyer. The audio clips of them discussing their plans to sell the estate. The bank transfers leading to offshore accounts under Lexi's alias. Whispers erupted in the gallery. Lexi's lawyer stood. Objection. This evidence was obtained under questionable circumstances. The judge glanced at Evelyn. Do you have legal verification of these documents? Evelyn smiled. Not only are they verified, but we have a forensic accounting report confirming the fraud. And, Your Honor, she turned toward the back of the room, the FBI has already launched an investigation based on this evidence. Before Judge Harrison could respond, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 men in suits stepped inside. Judge Harrison, one of them announced, flashing a badge. We need you to come with us for questioning regarding financial misconduct. The room gasped. The judge's expression barely flickered, but his knuckles turned white where they gripped his gavel. I don't know what you're talking about. Raphael smirked. Oh, I think you do. One of the agents approached the bench. We have records of your involvement with offshore account transfers linked to Mrs. Bryant. We'll discuss them in private. The judge shifted, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he turned to the bailiff. We will take a brief recess. But before he could bang the gavel, another voice interrupted. Not so fast. A second group of agents stepped forward. This time, they approached Lexi. Mrs. Bryant, the lead agent said, you are under arrest for financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. The color drained from Lexi's face as the room exploded into shocked murmurs. You can't do this, she shrieked, standing so abruptly that her chair tipped over.
This is a setup.
I demand a private discussion. Save it, the agent said. We have enough evidence to keep you behind bars for a long time. Dan Parker, who had been suspiciously quiet, suddenly shot to his feet. This is ridiculous. There's no proof tying me to anything. The agent turned toward him. Mr. Parker, you're also under arrest for your role in forging legal documents and aiding in financial fraud. Dan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Lexi, still reeling, turned to me, her face twisted in fury. You think this is over, Cynthia? She spat. You don't know what you've done. I stood, meeting her glare without flinching. I know exactly what I've done, I said calmly. I took back what was mine. And now you get to face the consequences. The agent tightened the cuffs around her wrists, pulling her toward the aisle. As she was dragged away, her voice echoed through the courtroom. You'll regret this. Every last one of you. I watched her disappear through the doors, feeling no fear. No doubt. Just relief. Raphael exhaled, shaking his head.
Well, that was satisfying.
Francesca grinned. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Cynthia. I smirked, sitting back down as the courtroom quieted once more. Lexi had played her last hand. And she lost. The mansion felt different now. Not just because Lexi was gone, not just because the legal battles were over, but because for the first time in years it finally felt mine. The weight of the past had been lifted, and in its place was something lighter. Clarity, purpose. I stood in my father's study, the place where this entire storm had started, running my fingers along the polished wood of his desk. The safe behind the painting was open now, its secrets exposed. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed before. A small, leather-bound journal, tucked behind a false panel. My fingers trembled as I opened it, the familiar handwriting making my breath hitch. My dearest Cynthia, if you're reading this, then you've already learned what I always feared. You're going to have to fight for what's yours. I built this home for our family, for you. But I also knew that someday, someone would try to take it from you. That's why I put protections in place, why I fought so hard to secure the trust. I didn't want you to have to fight alone. Trust your instincts. Trust the people who stand beside you. And most importantly, trust yourself. This house was never just a house. It's a symbol of strength, of resilience. Let it be more than just a home. Let it be a legacy. With all my love.
Mom.
Tears welled in my eyes as I closed the diary, holding it against my chest. She had known. She had always known. I wiped my face and took a deep breath. It was time to decide what came next. A week later, I stood outside the east wing of the mansion, watching as workers unloaded furniture and supplies. What had once been an unused, forgotten part of the estate was being transformed. A women's shelter? Francesca asked, standing beside me. I nodded. Mom didn't just want this house to be a home. She wanted it to be a place of safety. She fought to build something that lasted. I want to do the same. Raphael crossed his arms, surveying the work with approval. Dad would be proud. Melina leaned against the doorway, her smirk softer than usual. Not bad, little sister. Not bad at all. I smiled, something warm settling in my chest. The media had already picked up the story. Daughter outsmarts stepmother, saves family estate. People were calling it inspirational, a story of justice, resilience. But to me, it was never about revenge or even winning. It was about protecting what mattered. I looked around at the people standing beside me, Raphael, Francesca, even Melina. Lexi had tried to take my family away, but in the end, She had only made us stronger. For the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't alone. I had a family, and together, we were unbreakable.